Hey students, so this is just going to be a quick review of Upstone's chapter on formalism and new criticism, and I'm just going to keep the book in front of me and sort of go through and pull out a few things. Um, One element that I sort of want to make clear is that I think much of the impulse towards new criticism and that sort of real focus on language comes from people who take, I would say, a lot of delight in language, right? That part of what they love about literature is the way poets use language, the way writers, people like Joyce, for example, use language, and that gives them tremendous pleasure, right? And so when they start critiquing lit, they're looking at it in those terms. They are looking at um, use of language and sentence structure and so on that often is playful or otherwise just sort of interesting um, as an element. That doesn't have to be what you come to literature for. And I think that's sort of the big problem with new criticism is that it tends to leave all the other stuff behind, all the other reasons. So and as they say here in this opening, in the early 20th century, everyone it seemed was reading poetry, decadent aesthetic poetry and modernist poetry. And so if you keep that in mind, that'll help explain sort of where this approach comes from. And I'll say, they reference T.S. Eliot. Eliot is great. I get a lot of pleasure out of reading, experimental, fun, interesting poetry. And I actually wanted to give you an example of, let's see, which one of these, an E. Cummings poem that I really like. Um, mm, okay, here it is. Okay, it's called Since Feeling is First, and I'm just going to read it to you. You can Google and look it up. It's not very long. Since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. Holy to be a fool while spring is in the world. My blood approves, and kisses are a better faith than wisdom. Lady, I swear by all flowers, don't cry. The best gesture of my brain is less than your eyelids flutter, which says we are for each other. Then laugh, leaning back in my arms, for life's not a paragraph, and death, I think, is no parenthesis. So part of what I find delightful about that is the way that he's playing with these tropes around structure, paragraphs and parentheses and so on. Also, the way he repeats holy, will never wholly kiss you, holy to be a fool, kind of adds this extra emphasis. Um, there's a little kind of hidden rhyme in when he says, the best gesture of my brain is less than your eyelids flutter, which says we are for each other. So that flutter other is kind of a near rhyme. All of that adds to the sense of the poem, right? I'm going to read you one more that is maybe even stronger as we're heading towards Valentine's Day. I'm giving you a couple love poems. So this one's I carry your heart with me, I carry it in. And if you, I recommend you go and look it up because Cummings does really interesting things with commas, with capitalization, with parentheses, etc. So if you just hear it, you actually won't get everything he's doing. I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear. And whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you are whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root and the bud of the bud and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. So take a look at that and look at what he does with parentheses and he often like doesn't put a space and how that changes things. So all of that kind of analysis, I think, is a pretty standard new critical approach. And you can see, I think, how it's useful for poetry and also for fiction. Um, it's a it's asking you to slow down and pay attention to a lot of things very closely that you might not have paid attention to otherwise. Um, so I'm going to now kind of skimming over this. There's this term practical criticism, the close formal analysis of a literary work without reference to its outside context. So we talked about that in class. And she talks about Leavis, that Leavis was very anti-pop culture, right? He was an outspoken critic of what he saw as the devaluing of art by pop culture. He advanced through his work, the great tradition, the idea of close reading as a test of what made quote unquote great literature. And he ends up with a very narrow list of Henry James, Jane Austen, Joseph Conrad, and George Eliot. And I certainly agree that these are great writers, but the narrowness of the list is a concern, right? And of course, like all of this is influenced by his approach and his reasons for it. Reading is not a neutral activity, according to Leavis, but a morally improving one. The reader must be directed to the most valuable works of literature. So not everybody goes to literature for moral improvement, I would say. I think there are other things that literature can do. So anyway, she goes on, she talks about this. I want to clarify a little bit here in the literary fallacy section where she's talking about the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. I think the key idea bit is a little unclear. She says, intentional fallacy is a method of reading literary text without concern for what the author intended, looking only at the text on the page. So it's not really a method. I would say intentional fallacy is sort of a concept pointing out that that if you ask what the author intended, that doesn't necessarily define what meaning there is in the text, right? If I write a story and I say, and someone reads it and says, I thought this was about, I don't know, paganism. I just made something up. And I come back and I'm thinking, well, when I wrote this story, I thought I was writing about social class issues, right? The fact that I, the author, had something in mind when I wrote the story, I had an intention, doesn't mean necessarily that that's all there is in the story. For one thing, who knows what was going on in my subconscious? There may be things that I was working with that I wasn't aware of. So that intention is already a problem. And B, even if I didn't intend it on any level, that doesn't mean that the work doesn't also have an existence and have an effect beyond that, right? So they then go on to talk about the affective fallacy, which is a method of reading literary text without concern for the effect of the text on the reader, right? And so again, it's a useful concept, right? To say, well, when I'm looking at this text, I don't care whether it makes the reader feel romantic or exalted, or in the case of Poe, horrified. I can still analyze its worth as literature, even if the reader is not having any of that kind of effect. And that's true, right? So both of these, I would say, are true, but sort of in a limited way, right? And if you say, well, the writer's intent isn't everything, fine, but that doesn't mean it's nothing. And if you say the effect on the reader isn't everything, also fine, doesn't mean it's nothing, right? And so that's where the new critics would kind of discard both of those things. So then she transitions from there into continental formalism, talking about Russian formalism spreading across Europe. And they, like their Anglo-American counterparts, she says these scholars were disenchanted with the aesthetic movement and particularly with symbolism, right, which we've spent a little time on. Instead, they looked to futurism. And not to get too far into this, the Italian artistic futurist movement ended up being very connected to fascism. And so it's a kind of hugely problematic thing. and which is frustrating for me because I would like to be able to talk about futurism in a completely different context now. And some academics are always going to connect it to that Italian fascist moment. So that's sort of like a little bit of a tension right now in science fiction studies. But so they're looking for forward-thinking developments, and they want the influences of romanticism and the aesthetic movement. They want to reject that and replace their emotion with more scientific approaches. Okay, so as an overarching thing, I think it's fair to say that there's a pendulum in sort of literary modes, in fashions, and it tends to swing between the more emotional feeling, sometimes spiritual approach, and then people get frustrated with that, and you get a swing towards the rational, skeptical, ordered approach, scientific, etc. And then people swing back. And if you take the American Lit class, for example, I think you can pretty clearly see each generation kind of pushing back against, of writers pushing back against the generation before. So that sort of makes sense that after the aesthetics with their somewhat romantic approach, the pre-Raphaelites, etc., you would get this pushback towards a more scientific, structured, like we're going to be able to analyze this and take it apart and see exactly what specific things have exactly this kind of result. And out of that, we will be able to calculate, if you put in 25 metaphors and 12 synonyms and, blah, 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 then you, at the end, you will equal great literature, right? They really wanted to do that, I think. And it doesn't work for me, but, and out of that, we get this whole debate about, what does it mean to say something is literary? And Jacobson, who they refer to in 1921, he talks about this quality of literariness. The literary text has unique qualities to distinguish it from other kinds of written texts, such as journalism, memoir, and factual writing, right? And I basically disagrary with this pretty strongly, but you can follow it if you want. They ask how formalists think that the way literariness functions is through defamiliarization or making strange. Poetry doesn't use language in its normal everyday fashion, but in its own special way that makes it appear new and different. So here, I would say there is a value to that, right? Certainly Cummings does things that make it appear new and different. He plays with language. So does, in the text that I gave you to read for later this week, Delaney is considered a literary author. He does a lot of sort of formal experimental stuff with language. I think it's sort of funny that these critics settled on this as like, here is this big defining quality of what it means to be literary. And I hope we have mostly fallen away from that as a definition, because I would say defamiliarization is a useful technique, but there are lots of other techniques and there are lots of other ways we can use language. So I love Alice Munro short stories, for example, and Alice Munro writes very straightforward prose. If you Google, you should find her. She's one of America's great short story writers. And if you read like an opening paragraph of hers, you'll see that it's very straightforward. I'm just gonna quickly Google and see if I can get one. Yes, there are a bunch of them online that you can read right now. So I'll just kind of start with this paragraph. My father was a fox farmer. That is, he raised silver foxes in pens, and in the fall and early winter when their fur was prime, he killed them and skinned them and sold their pelts to the Hudson's Bay Company or the Montreal fur traders. These companies supplied us with heroic calendars to hang, one on each side of the kitchen door. Against a background of cold blue sky and black pine forests and treacherous northern rivers, plumed adventurers planted the flags of England or of France. Magnificent savages bent their backs to the portage. So I would say that first sentence is very straightforward and familiar. My father was a fox farmer, right? You could read that in any journalistic piece of writing. And the second sentence is also really very straightforward. You could find that in a newspaper. Third sentence as well. The fourth sentence, I will admit, she starts to use some more poetic language, and even some sort of, metaphorical stuff there. So, but I would say most of Monroe doesn't lean on that kind of play. She leans on the straightforward, and while it can be a delight to read people like Nabokov and Joyce who do really playful things with language, there's also a way in which sometimes it feels like they're showing off how clever they are, right? And Nabokov really was incredibly smart and like fluent in multiple languages and so on, and he brings all of that to his writing, and it's terrific. But his best work, I think, is not actually best because of the language play that enhances it. It's best because of sort of like the heart of what he's trying to do with something like Lolita, in terms of characterization. So, and I would say that is as much a literary quality as using defamiliarization, etc., to make things strange. I think there are lots of ways that you can get the reader to slow down, to think about something, to encounter it in a different way than they would in the everyday world. And that, and that certainly it feels sort of foolish to me to separate out something like memoir from literary writing, because memoir can use every one of those techniques that literary writing does. There's nothing in a memoir that says you can't do that. And there are memoirists who do that. So yeah, I guess. Okay, so there's some more in this. That's most of what I want you to get out of this. She goes on with several examples, and she talks about formalism as a structure, sort of a structural approach to all of this, which is useful. But I think that's the gist. Hopefully, this was helpful, and hopefully it will leave you a little suspicious of people who want to make big rules about what counts as literary and what doesn't. When you look at someone like Le Guin or the Benjamin Rosenbaum story, both of which I gave you, Illa's Choice, those are science fiction stories. And for a lot of people, science fiction, a lot of people in academia, science fiction is almost inherently like, it's pop culture. It couldn't possibly be literary. And I would probably, if I had to define it, I would say literary fiction is fiction that makes some attempt to do something interesting, paying attention to things such as language, such as character, such as, etc. That it's kind of reaching for that higher level. Higher is maybe not the right word, but maybe a more complex level is maybe right. Whereas commercial fiction generally isn't necessarily reaching for that. It is straightforward, and they just want to tell you a good story. So think about the difference between when you're reading something that just wants to tell you a good story and keep you engaged, and something that pushes you a little harder in some aspect. And I think that's maybe a useful way to think about things being literary or not. I would also say that just because it's more literary doesn't mean it's good, right? And I think that's super important. Like, what do we mean when we say good? If something is a rip-roaring, fabulous action adventure that keeps you on the edge of your seat, it's doing a good job of what it set out to do. And I would say there's a value in that, even if it doesn't have much in the way of literary qualities. And there's certainly plenty of things that do, in theory, kind of a good job with literary qualities, but are very boring. And I'm guessing that in your academic career so far, you have been subjected to some of these in high school and college. So you could do as an exercise, like make a list of like, what do you think the best things you've written are? Which are the most boring? And which ones did your English teachers think were worth spending time on? And which ones do you think are worth spending time on? So, all right. That's it for my little rant for today. Hopefully this was helpful in making sense of the Upstone. hopefully, if any of my colleagues see this, they will not pillory me for trashing some of these ideas, which I am not so impressed by. So yeah, that's it. We'll see each other on Wednesday. Bye. Oh my God. No, okay.